Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. COVID has worsened prison conditions worldwide. What are the human rights implications of the pandemic on prisons? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. The COVID-19 pandemic has created challenges in prisons and prisoner rights all over the world. Prison crowding and subpar living conditions have created ideal breeding grounds for the virus. On today's show, we examine how the pandemic has threatened the human rights of the incarcerated all over the world, including here in the United States. Our guests are John Raphling, senior researcher for Human Rights Watch and author of Averting an Imminent Catastrophe, Recommendations to U.S. Local, State, and Federal Officials to COVID-19 in Jails and Prisoners. And Steve Swerdlow, Associate Professor of the Practice at the University of Southern California. He has conducted extensive field research internationally with a particular focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. He also works as a consultant with the U.S. Commission in International Religious Freedom. John Raphling, I'll ask you first, what are some of the human rights challenges that COVID-19 have posed for prisoners, for the incarcerated?
Sure, thanks. And thanks for having me on the show. To begin with, as you alluded to in the introduction, prisons like cruise ships, like convalescent homes, where people are packed in living closely together, are just horrific breeding grounds for disease in general, for upper respiratory disease in particular, and especially for virulent disease like COVID-19. And so as the pandemic has spread, jails and prisons have been breeding grounds that have been almost uncontrollable or have not been controlled. I won't say it's been uncontrollable. They've not been controlled. And it's had a terrible effect within the institutions. And additionally, the disease is passed in and out. People who come into jail cycle in and out on a fairly short timetable and are bringing the disease in and bringing it back out into the surrounding community. Corrections officers, guards, other staff at jails and prisons bring the disease in, bring it out. And so, one, it's a humanitarian nightmare within the jails and prisons themselves. Two, it's contributing to the further spread outside of those institutions.
And Steve Swerdlow, John Raphling is describing a lot of what's going on in the United States. I imagine in a number of places around the world, particularly lesser developed countries, the conditions could be even worse. Is that true?
And also, thank you for having me. I think it's a really appropriate time in which we're having this conversation on the cusp of MLK Day, Martin Luther King Day, because of course he was a prominent political prisoner. And during COVID-19, as John said, in the US and also internationally, the human rights community is profoundly concerned about the additional risks that COVID-19 places on prisoners' rights, and then in particular on political prisoners' rights. One of the, just to add to the concerns that John raised about ensuring health and access to health care and just the inherent risks of overcrowding, we also see during this time of COVID-19 across the world, reduced access to justice, reduced access to counsel, to your lawyer. The inability of legal counsel being able to file motions in court on behalf of their imprisoned clients, get access to them in pretrial detention and in prison. And that, of course, opens up a whole world of possibilities for authorities to interrogate suspects without due process. We're seeing just a lot more risk of politically motivated prosecution and a whole number of concerns, which is what led the WHO and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the European Commission, and a whole host of institutions to issue guidelines at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was around April or May, calling on states to not only ensure the rights of access to healthcare that prisoners should enjoy, but also really to reduce overcrowding, start releasing prisoners. And unfortunately, almost a year into this, we really haven't seen that take place.
John Raphling, there's lots of stories about prisoners being released, being allowed, to be under house arrest rather than necessarily incarcerated in the prison. Are those stories deceptive at presenting an image of quite a large number of prisoners being released? Or are there actually a number of American prisoners that have been released to try to reduce some of the prison overcrowding?
There's variation by jurisdiction. In understanding the U.S. criminal legal system, you have to understand that there's the federal system. Each of the states has their own system. And then within the states, each county has their own way of doing things. And even on this issue, each police department may have its own procedures and processes. So there's a variety of responses. Some places early on in the pandemic, a couple of police departments, I believe Tucson and Philadelphia, said, look, we're not going to make custodial arrests of people on certain lower level charges. We're going to give them citations and have them ordered to come into court. Other police departments, the vast majority, said business as usual, even though by bringing people into custody, they're exposing their own officers and their own staff, as well as everyone else who's going through the system, to close contact and potential infection. Similarly, so that's at one level, and I'm not saying that Philadelphia or Tucson kept up with those policies. They announced them initially. I'm not sure how systematically they upheld those policies. In Los Angeles County, for example, there was initially a pretty substantial reduction in jail population. There was an effort by the courts and with some cooperation from the sheriff, DAs, public defenders, working together to get people out of custody. And so they did. They reduced the numbers from something like 17,000 to about 12,000 at the lowest, which sounds great until you realize that 12,000 was the actual capacity of the jail. They just went from being vastly overcrowded to the amount, the population it should be without a pandemic. And since then, the population has gone back up, maybe not to the full pre-pandemic numbers. That's been the pattern in a number of places. There's been a lot of talk about, oh yeah, we should lower jail and prison populations, but the action has been relatively minor. There have been some releases, kind of enough to make it look good politically and to make some of the policymakers feel like, well, we've done something. We let 300 people out. You've got 5,000 people in the jail. The standard, right, to what would actually be an adequate response is, the standard is that you have to have enough space in the jail to where people can maintain social distance, plain and simple, just like for us on the outside, and to where people can be, who have symptoms, who have had contact, can be separated from other people in a non-punitive way. And this is a very important thing, because what reports that I've been getting and have been hearing consistently are that people in jails, and especially in prisons, are afraid to report symptoms because they know they'll be set into solitary confinement, which is punitive and at a certain point can veer into actually being torture. And so people don't want to get put in solitary confinement. And so they keep quiet about their symptoms, continuing to infect other people. So there's a variety of issues around it that, bottom line, comes down to, if you don't reduce the jail or prison populations, you're going to continue to have a dangerous spread. By dangerous, I mean, we're talking about large numbers of people dying.
And John, actually, as a quick follow-up, those who
Sure.
are being released, what types of crimes are they typically convicted of if they're being released?
Good question. And the use of the word convicted of. A lot of the people who are getting released are people who were being held pre-trial, as in they were in jail and hadn't been convicted of anything. Now that leads into a whole other set of issues and human rights issues around pretrial incarceration and the coercion inherent in holding people who haven't been convicted of crime. So one of the things that has happened is the politically easier approach has been to release people who are being held pretrial for relatively lower level offenses. And so, for example, in California, the Judicial Council at one point set something, a $0 bail schedule for most offenses, meaning if you get arrested, your bail is set at zero, so you're going to get released. In other words, we're not going to do pretrial incarceration. And it was actually relatively successful. I mentioned the time period when there was reductions in jail populations. That was one of the things that was a big help. Well, law enforcement doesn't like it because it reduces their level of control, and they went on a big kind of media blitz about all the crime going up, which was not actually supported by facts and data. But anyway, so decisions are being made about who to release and who not to release. The recommendations obviously are to start with people who are most vulnerable. Courts and law enforcement want to release people on the lowest level crimes to the extent they want to release people. But again, there's a range, and it depends on the commitment to actually ensuring safety. Sadly, that commitment has been lacking.
Now, Steve, certainly all prisoners have rights, and these concerns with prison conditions really are true regardless of what they've been accused of or convicted of. But in particular, those political prisoners, people who are, imprisoned for questionable offenses, are particularly egregious. Has COVID made those types of prisoners all the more vulnerable?
It has. We saw the death in July, for example, in prison of a very prominent political prisoner named Azim Can Askarov, who was actually a human rights activist in prison 10 years earlier, a member of an ethnic minority group in Kyrgyzstan, but also really a prominent human rights activist and journalist. And the human rights community had been advocating for his release for many, many years. But when COVID happened, it was yet another blow. And the diagnosis upon his death that the authorities was released was pneumonia. So it was hard to prove definitively that he died of coronavirus, although the symptoms and all the indicators were that this was a COVID death. But really what killed him was the lack of humanity, the cruelty with which he and many other political prisoners have been treated in this period, which is just a blatant disregard for the basic and fundamental human rights obligations that states have. One guideline, which is relevant again to John's report, are the UN standards for the treatment of prisoners, which are called the Nelson Mandela rules, which were named in honor of him, the most famous political prisoner, which really give the baseline standards on overcrowding, on other standards that have to be met. But as you said, political prisoners are under extreme risk because, when governments want to silence or muzzle the messenger, again, COVID-19, in a way, it allows an additional level of it's an additional excuse that authorities can use to really keep these people far away from the press, far away from their families. So I just got back from Uzbekistan, where I was doing some research for the past few months on political prisoners and religious prisoners. And there was several cases that I was trying to raise with the government where, in lieu of actually releasing these prisoners, at least I was making the argument that the authorities should be willing to place people to move them into house arrest. And indeed, there were many, many cases in which family members would contact me and say, my father is 68 years old in a prison in the middle of Uzbekistan, and there's simply no justification for why so many states around the world, from Saudi Arabia, China, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, seem to be disregarding this really clear advice that they're getting from the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, from, as I said, the Office on Drugs and Crime. Many different institutions have been really unanimous in calling for for human rights standards to be applied. But when it comes to political prisoners, I think what COVID-19 does is just really ups the stakes. And it means we have to fight even harder to get these people out as quickly as we can.
You're listening to Scholar Circle. I'm Doug Becker. We're discussing the impact of the pandemic on the human rights of prisoners, and in particular, political prisoners, with John Raphling and Steve Swerdlow. So, John Raphling, one of the issues that has sort of been burning with me is whether or not this pandemic might change some of the discourse about criminal procedures and about prisons. You had mentioned that where you're seeing these cases where prisoners are being released are really pretrial incarceration. I know here in California, there's been a lot of conversation about bail reform and those sorts of issues. Do you foresee the experiences we've had with COVID having any sort of an impact on just broadly the question of how often people are incarcerated before they even face trial?
That's a really good question, and one that I'm hopeful about. I mentioned earlier they instituted statewide for a short period of time this $0 bail, which kept a large number of people who would otherwise be held pre-trial. It kept them out of custody. It didn't take the Judicial Council, the sort of governing body of the California judiciary, very long before they reversed that $0 bail order. But there was a period of time where we had it, and we still have one in place in Los Angeles County, where we were able to see that it wasn't some crime disaster, right? Releasing all of these people. So it does give us as advocates and as people who are looking at this issue in good faith, a model of a time period when pretrial incarceration was reduced, and it was not a disaster, and in fact, it worked fairly well. So the problem, of course, is that you have some very entrenched and powerful interests within our legal system that very much rely on the use of pretrial incarceration, and that felt very threatened by the reduction in incarceration altogether that at least started in response to the pandemic. And they've resisted it and resisted it again with fatal consequence, right? And this is particularly law enforcement, but the judges, prosecutors have strongly resisted the large-scale level of release of people from jails and prisons that's necessary to ensure safety. So the question will be whether they're willing to give up an element of power that they get from the ability to incarcerate within the system, and whether they're willing to sort of acknowledge the human necessity of winding down incarceration.
And Steve, internationally, has the pandemic opened up any new areas of discourse, of discussion about the use of incarceration for certain types of crimes?
Well, yeah. I mean, on one level, it further underlines or highlights the need for organizations like the International Committee for the Red Cross to finally get access to countries that have closed them off for years and not allow them to monitor prison conditions. So, for example, that's the situation that I know best in my neck of the woods in Central Asia. The International Committee for the Red Cross has been blocked from visiting prisons in Tajikistan, in Turkmenistan, in Uzbekistan, some of the world's most repressive regimes for many years. And I think COVID-19 only makes it more, the fierce urgency of now to get them access to so they can do their job and monitor conditions. But I think also on a level of international human rights law and standards for prisons in particular, I do see that there's a chorus of organizations that are doing the equivalent of what John is advocating for the U.S. is a rethink a re-examination of the standards that should apply, and the fundamental the problem of human dignity that's not being addressed. We've seen, I don't know what the tally is of how many prisoners have now died worldwide since the COVID-19 epidemic has begun. It's definitely in the thousands worldwide. And so Penal Reform International and many other organizations have been really trying to remind us of the basic standards that should apply, but that alternatives to incarceration have to be used as much as possible. And like I said, we also see these other concerns where access for lawyers are being cut off. We see the use of online court hearings happening, which is a good thing, of course, increasing access to justice. People in rural regions who can't travel need to have access to justice, and so they're using online courts. But of course, there are a lot of drawbacks involved in that. What happens when a judge turns off the video and ends the hearing prematurely, and you can't access your fundamental rights, your due process that is due to you? So there are pluses and minuses that have to do with things. Not also globalization in general is leading to a lot of changes in the way criminal justice is being handled across the world. But I think at the heart of this, we have to remind states that they have certain key obligations, and that even in times of emergency, I think all the international human rights norms point us in one direction, that even when you have a state of emergency, and maybe the COVID-19 qualifies as such, there are certain things that cannot be derogated from, certain fundamental rights. And that's the deprivation of liberty. You need access to your lawyer, you need access to all your fundamental due process rights. And in terms of political prisoners, just to remind us that we didn't define who they are. These are people whose rights whose imprisonment, I should say, is related to the denial of a basic fundamental right, the right to practice their religion, the right to freely assemble, freely associate, express themselves. So journalists, human rights defenders. And I think there needs to be, I'm hoping, of course, that we'll see, with this new administration coming in a few days, we'll see a renewed commitment around the world and a renewed focus on incarceration around the world and political prisoners within that.
Steve raises a really interesting issue, John, in that human rights internationally have generally been somewhat reliant on the US speaking authoritatively about human rights. But on this issue, and in particular, both prison conditions and also over sentencing for certain types of crimes, the United States not only is far from perfect, but even in comparison with, say, its European allies, the US seems to be particularly challenged, if not just on the wrong side of a lot of those issues. Is there any potential for movement where issues for over-sentencing, in particular for things like nonviolent crimes like drug possessions or economic types of crimes, that a recognition that the United States needs to rethink some of the sentencing guidelines?
So the United States for some time has been the world's leader in incarceration. And when you look at what we incarcerate for, it runs a whole spectrum from, serious violent crimes down to, crimes related to drug use, sex work. We criminalize sitting on the sidewalk and sleeping in a car, right? Like, we have a vast array of criminal laws that we use incarceration and other punishment as a response to. But even further and even deeper is that we address societal problems in the United States through policing, prosecutions, and prisons, as opposed to actually investing in uplifting communities, in services, in healthcare, things of that nature. So the United States has not set a good example for the rest of the world, and very much is lagging in that regard. More optimistically, though, in recent years, there's really been building a more powerful movement to change this. And it's really coming from the local, but building out to all levels of government. But particularly, I'm in the Los Angeles area. A strong local movement removed a district attorney who was very committed to the old punishment paradigm and made it possible for a district attorney who has promised to unwind some of that punishment to replace her. A strong local movement passed Measure J in Los Angeles County, which basically allocates funding to services and support and care and not to incarceration and away from policing and incarceration. There have been a series of measures at the state level that have changed some of the most harsh punishment reform on the 3 strikes law, Prop 57, Prop 47, which reduced some of the punishments for these crimes. And these have been generated because of local, statewide, and national organizing by people within the communities that have been really ravaged by these punitive policies. So there is reason for optimism because there is this movement that continues to build. But again, we see law enforcement and sort of the law enforcement bureaucracy clings to power and reacts, and there's money and power in all of these laws and systems.
And I'd be remiss to just identify COVID as what's driving this, because certainly the Black Lives Matter protests, the defund the police movement as a result of the murder of George Floyd, probably have much more of an impact on those questions than even COVID, though it's hard to de-link those two, the pandemic and the defund the police movement, raising a number of issues. But Steve, I also wanted to ask you, I know that there have been a number of cases of political prisoners who have died as a result of COVID, been infected as a result of COVID. Do you have any specific examples that you can share?
Well, in July, an imprisoned Iranian journalist named Nargiz Mohammadi wrote in a letter, "Our bodies are ruined. There are 12 of us in the ward who have come down with the coronavirus." And she was writing from Iran's Zanjan prison. And she writes, "In the last few days since the disease was discovered, they separated us from the healthy people. There are absolutely no facilities nor medical care here in the ward. We don't even have hand sanitizer. They just give us ibuprofen. I feel totally paralyzed from the knees down and I can't breathe. I'm thinking this is the end of the line and that I won't make it until morning, that it's all over and done with." And I think her words really sum up just how awful, just how catastrophically this situation has affected prisoners and political prisoners around the world. I'm also thinking of people I know that I've advocated for in Tajikistan, a political activist named Rahmatullah Rajab, or a human rights lawyer also in prison there, named Buzurg Mariorov, an ex-diplomat that I know in Uzbekistan named Kadir Yusupov. All these are individuals who seem to have come down with COVID. Their lives are at risk. And I think those words that Nargiz wrote just should inspire us to redouble our efforts and speak truth to power and make sure that states know that they can't renege on their obligations and that they have to be held accountable. And there's really simply no excuse, no reason, as John has so clearly laid out in the US case and in others, that alternative solutions can't be pursued. And this should be a time, if there's any bright line to this terrible tragedy and pandemic, it should be a clarity that we receive about what human rights we all have, including the most vulnerable of us in detention, in prison, around the world.
Yes, and a reminder that human rights as a concept, we all have human rights irrespective of our behavior. And in particular, the most vulnerable are the ones that are the most demanding for the respect of human rights. So I'm hoping that the conversations about the impact of COVID in prisons raise the specter of the need for reform on how we treat prisons, how we treat prisoners, and what kinds of sentences that we give for crimes, what kinds of incarceration before somebody is convicted, and ultimately the way we treat those that we find in our prison system. We've been discussing COVID and the impact on prisons. Our guests have been John Raphling, senior researcher for Human Rights Watch and the author of Averting an Imminent Catastrophe: Recommendations to U.S. local, state, and federal officials to COVID-19 in jails and prisoners. And Steve Swerdlow, associate professor of the practice at the University of Southern California. He's conducted extensive field research internationally, and with a particular focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. He also works as a consultant for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.